Hello, I am Max Henrion. I'm very pleased to be presenting as part of Risk Awareness Week 2022. And I'm going to be talking about how utilities can reduce risks and get the most bang for the buck in terms of their investments in risk reduction. I'll be talking about mostly California utilities, and some of them have been in the news for all the wrong reasons. I'll give you a few examples to motivate this work. So just 12 years ago in San Bruno, south of San Francisco, there was a massive explosion from a leak in a gas main that ruptured. It destroyed 38 houses and killed 8 people, and resulted in criminal violations filed and obstruction of justice against the utility, Pacific Gas and Electric, who settled a case with the victims for over $500 million, with an additional $1.6 billion levied as a fine by the California Public Utility Commission. Another example, the Aliso Canyon gas storage leak. This facility, operated by Southern California Gas, had a massive leak between October 2015 and February 2016 that released over 100,000 tons of gas, with a global warming potential equal to about 2 million cars driving for over a year, resulted in a $1.8 billion settlement. The third and perhaps most horrifying example was the Camp Fire that I imagine most of you heard about in 2018, ignited by a faulty PG&E transmission line, which burnt 153,000 acres, destroyed about 18,000 buildings, including almost the entire town of Paradise, California, resulted in over 80 fatalities, a settlement of $16.5 billion for business, and 84 counts of manslaughter against PG&E, leading to their filing for bankruptcy. So the stakes for a lot of these utilities is not a small thing. Then a last example, the Colonial Pipeline, which suffered a ransomware attack also last year. This pipeline delivers about 45% of the fuel used in the US East Coast. It was shut down for about a week due to this attack, creating price hikes in gasoline and long lines at gas stations. Colonial Pipeline paid the dark side hackers, as it turned out to be, 75 Bitcoin, about $5 million, to get a decryption key. Oddly, it turned out that it was easier for them to retrieve all their lost files and systems from backup than it was to wait for the decryption key to decrypt all that stuff. Later on, the FBI actually even retrieved the ransom payment, kind of undermining the idea that Bitcoin is anonymous, although unfortunately by that point the value of Bitcoin had crashed by about 50%, so they didn't get all their money back. So here are just a few noteworthy examples of the kinds of risks that different utilities face. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about cyber threats and what the problem is faced by risk analysts, risk managers. And cyber threats There's a whole variety of different types of threat. Here's just a few of them causing a headache for our risk manager. So, well, maybe it's partly solved by a bunch of controls or mitigations that could be applied to counter these threats. But unfortunately, this just creates an additional headache for the risk manager. Which of these controls should they apply? They cost, varying amounts, but in some cases quite a bit to acquire and deploy, and need to select a portfolio of these that's most appropriate for the problem at hand. Similarly, we think about wildfire and gas explosions. There's a whole set of mitigations to reduce the risk of wildfire ignited by power lines. Some of the examples here are public safety power shutoff. This means a preemptive shutting off the power when the wind is blowing strong and the vegetation is dry. Of course, that annoys a lot of people who are relying on reliable source of electricity. So how do you make those trade-offs? Others include enhanced vegetation management, basically removing trees and other vegetation that might fall onto the lines. And covered conductors, meaning you put a covering on the overhead conductors that reduces the chance of igniting vegetation. And then finally, perhaps the most effective is simply to bury the lines underground. Similarly, if we talk about risk of gas explosions from pipelines, there's a variety of different mitigation options. Here's just a very few of them. A lot of them involve testing the pipeline, checking it out to see if there's potential problems, and then replacing them where the pipeline seems to have suffer from corrosion or cracking. So let's talk about undergrounding for a moment. Last year, the Dixie fire that started in July 13th, due to a tree contacting a PG&E line, was the largest fire in terms of the number of acres burned in California, destroyed 1,400 buildings, although fortunately no fatalities. So who would want to be a CEO of a utility in California under these circumstances? Well, one person is Patty Poppe, who took the job early last year, and during the fire announced plans to bury 10,000 miles of line underground at an estimated cost of $20 billion. So this sounds like maybe a good solution, but it's kind of expensive. It's going to put up the price of electricity for ratepayers. Is it worthwhile? Not an easy question to answer. So the California Public Utility Commission, that's the regulator for these California utilities, has developed a risk decision framework to try to answer these questions. It includes and requires the investor-owned utilities to identify and quantify all the risks, including wildfires, explosions, cyber attacks, and quite a wide variety of other risks, to identify mitigations available, controls that might reduce or avoid these risks, and quantify their effectiveness and their cost. And then they have to submit every 3 years a risk assessment mitigation plan. This is a document that details the results of their analysis. They put it together with their every 3 years their application to change, usually increase their rates from the Utility Commission. And so it's pretty important to them in terms of their profitability as well as their reputation with their ratepayers. This risk decision framework specifies that they should use risk spend efficiency, RSE, as a metric, as a guide to selecting mitigations. It also says they should develop a multi-attribute value function, MAVF, to quantify the consequences of risk events in terms of a variety of different attributes or properties of the risks, including safety, which may include injuries and fatalities, reliability, is the power or gas available? How often do ratepayers experience outages and costs? So what is this risk spend efficiency first? So I'm actually going to show an equation, the only slide that has an equation, relatively simple, I think you'll find it. So they define risk in a pretty conventional way. The risk in an event is the product of its likelihood and its consequence. What's the chance of a downed power line or a tree falling on a power line igniting a wildfire? And if it does, what's the consequence? Each of these things, of course, is highly uncertain and is required to be modeled probabilistically. So the risk spend efficiency of a mitigation is essentially the reduction in risk, the difference between the risk of the event without mitigation and the risk with mitigation, and the ratio of that to the cost of the mitigation. And we sum this over all the risk events that may be affected by the mitigation. So in principle, it's a pretty simple metric, really something like a benefit cost ratio for cost benefit analysts. Although the risk, as I mentioned, is estimated as a multi-attribute value function. So here's an example. So for each of the attributes, there's a units, fatalities for safety, customer minutes interrupted for reliability, and dollars for financial. And then we specify a low bound of 0 and an upper bound, which is sort of the highest plausible value of that for a risk event. And for a particular risk event, may have a value, let's say 20 fatalities, 500 million customer minutes interrupted, and $500 million. And then we say what percent of the range lower to upper does each value correspond to. We apply a scaling function, which may be nonlinear to express a risk attitude, or linear, and a weight. We multiply the scaled scores together, sum them to get a weighted score. So this is kind of a simplified version of the multi-attribute value function that the California utilities have been using in the past. And in fact, of course, the value, the outcome of a particular risk is going to be uncertain, so they compute that probabilistically, although they don't currently generally propagate the distributions through to the weighted risk score, as I and some colleagues are recommending that they actually should. So let's go back to cybersecurity. Here's an example of a tool implemented in Analytica used for estimating, first of all, risks of cyber attacks, and then the value of controls. So those of you familiar with the FAIR framework, which is widely used for structuring assessment and cybersecurity assessment of risks, decompose it into a loss event frequency, loss magnitude, primary loss, secondary loss. I won't go into all the details. And then we assess distributions over the leaves of this tree and propagate them to get an uncertain distribution over the annualized loss exposure. And then we define a set of controls. So this goes beyond the standard FAS structure to identify for each control. In this case, multi-factor authentication is a particular type of cyber attack control. Which risks does it apply to? How effective is it in reducing those risks? 60%. And what are the costs of acquiring the control, installing it, training people to use it effectively? What are the side effects, perhaps in reducing or taking time for people to use it, so on. And we can then define a set of portfolios, these columns of portfolios. The last one is all controls. And for each of the portfolios, the tool will estimate the total risk and risk reduction for each of the risks, and also for the portfolio as a whole. And then finally, we apply an RSE, risk spend efficiency curve, to help select a set of mitigation projects in the portfolio. So this graph plots each of these points as a risk reduction or a mitigation option, a control. And the vertical axis is the cumulative risk reduction. As we add each of these controls, we increase the reduction in risk. And then the horizontal axis is the cumulative cost as we add more controls. And we order the projects, we add them by decreasing RSE. So let's say auto backup, automatic backup of our files and systems. That's pretty effective against ransomware attacks like the Colonial Pipeline attack, and which in fact they had, and it did save them to some extent. And we put that in first because it has the highest RSE ratio, risk reduction to cost. And then we'll see as we add more, the slopes get shallower. And in fact, the slope between each project and the preceding project indicates its RSE. So we add the most cost-effective or the highest RSE projects. And then we can specify a budget. And in this case, let's say $120 million. And if that's all we have available and that we're showing the cumulative cost, then we will select projects that are below the budget, and let's say penetration cost testing, which is outside the budget. We'll have to omit that this year. So it provides a kind of guide to which project to select. So now let's return again to see how this kind of thing might apply to wildfire and gas explosions. So here's a bow tie diagram, with an event, a wildfire event, ignition. It's various drivers: contact with vegetation, failure of equipment, third-party damage. Let's say somebody driving their backhoe into a line accidentally, or a crane. And its consequences, the magnitude of fire. So it's useful to embed this kind of bow tie diagram in an influence diagram that shows all the outside pieces. So on the top left, we have the causal factors, climate trends that may affect dryness of vegetation, wind, prevalence of storms and high wind that can cause equipment failures and so on. And then on the top right, the multi-attribute value function that takes effects of the fire, like fatalities, injuries, damage to property, and outages, and combines those through this multi-attribute value function to get an overall assessment of the consequences of the risk event. And then bottom middle, these green rectangles are the decisions, the mitigations, the things that we can do to reduce risk, which I talked about already, these examples in the case of fire risk, PSPS, vegetation management, up to undergrounding. And these we compute using the definition of RSE, what RSE can be attributed to each of these mitigations as we add them incrementally. So we use, and now I'm going back to an example analytical model, that anagram that's used for natural gas risk assessment and management, that uses influence diagrams like BBAB, although in this case to help assess mitigations to gas explosions from potential cracks or other threats to gas pipelines. And it's designed to assist a gas utility operator to assess and manage risks of these different types, and has a set of dashboards, as you'll see, and uses RSE, of course. So here's one dashboard. We have a map showing assets or transmission pipelines, and click on each pipeline as in the map to see various details about what type it is, what's the likelihood of failure, what's the risk per mile, what's the reduction in risk from the mitigation. And the color, in this case going green to red, we can decide what it plots. In this case, we might plot RSE. So that way we know which assets have the highest RSE, and therefore seem things like assets and mitigations that we would want to include in a mitigation project. We assemble them into a table of assets to define the mitigation project. And then as we add new assets, pipeline segments for the most part, you can see the risk reduction and the risk spend efficiency. And then finally, we can look at a bunch of these projects to try to define a portfolio of projects using an RSE curve. Before we saw the RSE curve for cyber threats, cyber controls. Here we're seeing it for mitigations on gas risk threats to potential gas explosions. And again, we order them by decreasing RSE, and we can set a budget, in this case $8 million, to help us decide which are the most cost-effective projects in terms of risk reduction, or if you like, give us the biggest bang for the buck. Or maybe I should rather say, in this case, since they are projects aimed at minimizing the chance of a gas explosion, the least bang for the buck. So, apologies for that joke, which might not be in very good taste for those that are involved in this rather serious issue of how do you keep your customers safe. So, to summarize, I've emphasized that risk management, and this goes for any type of risk, is about decisions to mitigate risks. I mean, assessing risks, quantifying the probability of different types of risk, the frequency, is a lot of work. But it only becomes worthwhile if you're using it to inform decisions about which controls, which mitigations you're going to select to mitigate those risks. And actually, we need to look at these decisions. We can't typically look at mitigations one at a time because they interact, the risks interact with each other and the mitigations. For example, if you're going to put your, a simple or kind of obvious example, if you're going to put your transmission lines underground, then there's much less value in vegetation management. And the cost of the mitigations may also interact. So you need to look at a collection of mitigations together and assess that RSE. So risk spend efficiency, I think, is a pretty nice metric. It's similar really to benefit cost ratio used in benefit cost analysis, although expanded in this case to deal with multiple attributes. And these RSE curves become a fairly intuitive way to help risk managers choose mitigations. And again, to emphasize, risks typically have multiple types of consequence, multiple attributes: safety, reliability, cost, maybe environmental impacts, and others. And it's really useful to combine them explicitly. And then finally, what I've tried to illustrate here rather briefly are some of the methods that California electric and gas companies and the regulator, the California Public Utility Commission, are essentially innovating in the methods that they use to assess risk and to regulate it. I've been part of a group with Sam Savage and others to consult to the Public Utility Commission and assess the RAMP reports, the way the utilities are using RSE. And I see quite a lot of benefits in what they're doing, but also some significant pitfalls that they're currently looking at remedying. I think, California is not the only state or even country in the world that's experiencing increased risk of wildfires as climate change it looks like it's only increasing the rate of wildfires, the frequency and severity. And of course, it's also increasing the frequency and severity of storms, floods, hurricanes, and other events. And there's also an increase in the frequency and severity of cyber attacks. So, although presumably not, we can't blame that on climate change. So other utilities and regulators in the US and perhaps around the world, I think, could learn a few things from the experience of the California utilities, both what to do and perhaps what to avoid. So I hope you found this interesting, and I look forward to your comments, which you can send, if this is live, by chat, or otherwise I would much appreciate any comments or questions by email. You can also learn more about anagram and RSE looking at the Lumina website and a variety of other places. Thanks so much.